Also, some of the software systems, be it SPM or Census, you're starting to get more data, which 10 years ago you didn't have even some of that data to help you out. So I think we're becoming more data rich, and I think that there's more things that are forthcoming to help us in those lights.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with the frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're wicked glad you did. Now, turn on those washes and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with David Kelman, founder and president of Kelman and Company Consulting, LLC. And Hank, just another guest. What a surprise. You found him on LinkedIn because of one of your engaging and provocative LinkedIn posts. And lo and behold, a conversation is born out of that, and a conversation centered around the financial management and the practicality of it when it comes to surgical instrument budgets. And we're going to get into it with David in this interview. But one of the things that is so interesting about surgical instrumentation and budgeting is it's a lot of onesie twosies. It's a great deal of volume that is typically at a lower purchase point. So getting a handle on all of those instruments and when you're going to need more, and then trying to collate them to instrument sets. And what do you really need? I can't tell you how many times, as a representative, a sales rep supporting sterile processing with repair and instrumentation, I'd get asked the question, we want to create X more of these sets. What do we need to buy? And, a lot of the catalogs out there certainly have a general standard that you can use for certain common types of sets. But the truth is this instrumentation gets purchased based on the culture in the department and what the personal preference of the surgeons are. And we're going to dive into that pretty in depth in this interview and really how that impacts the finances of sterile processing, which are getting pretty tight in healthcare these days.
Let me tell you a secret, Justin, about LinkedIn, because this is going to come up in the interview and you just brought it up again in this introduction. But it's so important when you see a conversation happen on LinkedIn in our space to, follow it, engage with it, comment or whatever, but then get connected and build a real relationship. Because you know what happened when I saw David pop up on this LinkedIn conversation? I gave him a call and I said, listen, I don't know you, but I want to get to know you. I want to know some of your insight. I want to know your background. Like, why did you feel like that was the direction that conversation had to go? Because it was great insight, and we're going to bring it up again in this interview. But that is how real networking is built. So if you're listening to this podcast, which you are if you're hearing my voice, and you want to grow your career, but not just grow your career, if you want to grow your exposure to the industry and your knowledge of what's going on, yes, use social media. Yes, listen to these podcasts, but take that next step. If you hear a guest and you're like, oh, I want to know more from that person, they're really talking about some interesting stuff, follow up with them through LinkedIn, through email, shoot us an email. Take that next step to personalize and build the network, because that's what's really going to help you grow your career, and it's what's going to help us grow the industry if we build these real deep connections where there's an exchange of information going both ways.
Yep, absolutely. And it's so easy on LinkedIn. You can just send them a message after you connect with them. So even if you just want to ask them a text question, if you didn't want to get on the phone, there's so many ways to engage. And anybody who's on LinkedIn is open to meeting people and having that discussion. So I just, again, I want to reiterate what you said there, Hank. I think it's really important, and it can really further your career and open your perspectives and get you more information and build your network that you can lean on, because there's no way we can all know everything. I certainly don't. We're going to be right back. This is going to be a great conversation with David Kelman, founder and president of Kelman and Company Consulting, LLC. Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is David Kelman, founder and president of Kelman and Company Consulting, LLC. And we're going to be talking about surgical instrument budgeting and really looking at it from both sides of the table based on David's experience. So, David, really excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and really why you have a particular interest in this topic and this area of finance related to instrumentation?
Well, I've spent 35 years working for orthopedic manufacturers, primarily in the design and development area, designing implant systems as well as the instrumentation to go with those. Early on, the life cycle of an implant system was 5 years. We were trying to get to the point where survivorship of these implant systems would be 15, 20 years, that hopefully the patient would have one implant for the rest of their life. We're slowly getting to that point. The last 6 years of my career have been spent really looking at logistics, because that is a major cost driver in the whole area of especially orthopedics, and also making up for my past sins of designing some of these instruments that the folks have to clean in central sterile.
So, David, I know as many good Beyond Clean podcasts get started, we recently had a conversation together on LinkedIn, and it was on a post that got a lot of traffic. One of my posts that I took a screenshot of a graph in one of the departments that I managed a number of years ago. And it was a real life, number representation of the instrument budget that I blew by about $1 million 1 year. And the feedback and interaction, was very interesting and engaging, but your comments, in particular, your perspective caught my eye. And we'll probably talk more about that a little bit later. But in that conversation, one of the themes that came up from a lot of the folks out in sterile processing from both sides of the table again was there's a problem. There's a problem with how these budgets today in these departments are being put together, what's being expected of the budgets, and really the traditional approach that hospitals and maybe also device manufacturers have taken to instrument budgeting. So can you kind of describe from your own perspective what that traditional model has looked like in the past?
Sure. When we look at central sterile departments, it really to the hospitals, it's a cost center. And really a lot of that is no different than what a manufacturer see in their own budgeting process. They look at what things are cost centers, and what they try to do is either hold those budgets very tight, either flat, or they try to reduce the budgeting into those cost centers while applying more of the capital and future expansion to the revenue sides of their business, be it the sales force, the items that help generate revenue in the hospital, it's expanding the operating rooms, and maybe acquiring primary care physicians or specialty groups as they're trying to generate their increase in revenue, because obviously they have increasing costs with increasing wages and insurance and things of that nature and supplies. So they have to grow the top line. They try to maintain the bottom line. The difficult part is that sometimes there is not always a one-to-one relationship between a cost center and the revenue line. And it's especially true with central sterile.
That piece about cost center, I think, always tends to get people a little riled up in sterile processing. And it's the truth, right? There's no debating that we don't charge for our services in the way that the operating room does, for instance. But it's such a stark difference when you're sitting as a department leader in those capital meetings, or you're putting your capital request together, for instance, or even you're putting your budget together. It doesn't even have to be capital budget. And you're sitting down there as a central sterile manager director beside the operating room and beside pharmacy services and all these other revenue generating departments. And you're like, well, I would like something as well. But your request And the size of your budget, to your point, is always seen as kind of a stepchild or on the bottom end of that totem pole, even though it's obvious to anyone who can look at the process of how revenue comes through the operating room, through surgeries, and how surgeries are done through sterile instrumentation and supplies. You don't get one without the other, but so oftentimes there is this financial disconnect, I guess, in that the availability of budgets to support that revenue. So where is the break, I guess, if we were to say, like, why are they treated the way that they are when it comes to these budgets? Is it just a short-sightedness on the part of these financial leaders? Like, I don't know where to begin. Like, how would you kind of sketch that problem out?
One, I'm not trying to take anything away from the Central Sterile. I referred to them as a cost center. I worked R&D and I was a cost center too. So
right.
I know the feeling. I think in part, you hate to say it, but I think there's a lack of understanding of what sterile processing really does. And with that said, that you look at the scenario, let's say that the hospital wants to perform another 100 surgeries, either with adding an OR or they brought on a new surgeon. So they just see it as, hey, we just added 100 surgical cases, and that'll increase our top line. And we have this department downstairs that cleans and sterilizes the instrumentation. They should be able to handle another 100 cases. That's not that great. I think part of the disconnect comes is that on average, you're going to run maybe another 5 instrument sets per each of those surgeries. So you now have a factor of 5. And if you're doing total joints, you could have added another 13 to 15 trays, level 4 trays into that mix. So the amount of time, power, capacity that's needed for that few additional 100 surgery cases has a much larger snowball effect to the central sterile department. And I think that's where part of the disconnect comes. Or the other aspect is that strategically, hospitals have been on a buying spree of buying clinics. And they don't realize that instrumentation from those clinics are now having to come back to your central sterile department, which wasn't part of the intent. So I think it's the disconnect of understanding what an increase in the revenue side of the business impacts central sterile. And it's not a 1-for-1 relationship. As I said, you may have a 1-to-13 relationship.
It's interesting you say that, because we got another podcast on the network that I do called Power Supply, and we just launched an interview here in June as we sit recording today, just a couple of days ago. And it was really talking about connecting supply chain with revenue cycle. And I think you just described that disconnect in a way is, we add this cost center, but we're not always sure how that cost relates to new revenue. And so for an organization, a healthcare organization to be, fiscally sound, you do kind of have to have some visibility to that, no?
Exactly. I've actually done some modeling where used the past couple of years of history of volume that a hospital system put through their central sterile, looked at the surgical schedule and the amount that was being done for the clinics, and then started asking, okay, over the next 3 years, what do you anticipate for your growth in the surgeries? Are you adding in more orthopedics, trying to grow orthopedics faster? What's your percentage growth rate? And what is your clinic growth? And quite honestly, they said, we have no clue what's happening in the clinics. The instruments show up. But we basically model it out, and we were able to create a proposed manpower requirement and capacity requirements for 3 years out. And I think that's part of what's missing is, as you said, Justin, looking at this and getting alignment. It's hospitals, manufacturers, they all have a 5-year strategic plan. And I think that's what's missing, is not connecting that 5-year strategic plan and what's going to happen down into the central sterile department and saying, this is what we're going to need years out. The other piece of that is talk to numerous hospitals that, yes, they've expanded their central sterile department, but 2 years later, they're back at the same boat that they were previously.
Yeah, that proper planning to know what you're going to be doing strategically over the next period of time. And even, again, just to tie back in revenue cycle, depreciating those assets. So you might need to get everything set up day one. And then if everybody looks at it like that's a this year cost association, it could make it look like your budget got totally blown out of the water. And even somebody who's a leader in sterile processing, they might never get into the conversation about how you're going to depreciate that capital acquisition cost over that strategic plan for the next so many years and how that gets represented on the budget. Sometimes it does, but especially for a new manager who doesn't really have that training or experience, that could be a real blind spot. And they might look at that first quote and go, oh no, everybody's going to freak out when I show them this.
Exactly. And the other piece too, that is people will talk about their cost to sterilize their trays. And they'll give you an average cost. Well, that's mixing the AMI level 1s with the 2s, with the 3s and the 4s. And they lump them all together as the same and say, well, this is what my sterilization cost is, versus saying, if you're a heavy ortho group, a hospital doing that, your cost per tray is going to be much higher, and you're over-reporting what your costs are on your simpler 1s and 2s. And or vice versa, or your model is going to be vice versa, that you're thinking that your cost to actually do the robotic arms or the loaner trays is much less. So it's trying to really get weighted averages and getting an idea what your true cost is per sterilization trays, so you can start understanding what your data is. When a sales rep brings in plan A, B, C, D, and E for a case, he thinks he's making sure he's covering his orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon. But what he doesn't realize is he just costs that hospital, if you just say it's $100 a tray to sterilize for those loaner trays, he just put $1,000 of cost to that surgery. And somebody does a simple ENT, and it really only costs you $50 to sterilize that tray. Well, you know what? That surgery may be a lot more economically profitable than the ortho tray just because of what the sales rep did.
Wow. You brought up a simple approach to this, which is do modeling and get a strategic plan together and ask what is the impact for increased surgical volume to sterile processing. That's pretty simple that you should be asking that question. But I know what goes into accurate modeling, as you've just pointed out, it's not a one-size-fits-all formula that you just apply across the board to all of your trays and all your volume and treat it all the same. There is complexity in there. And I think, definitely for our industry, there's going to be a lot of leaders out there thinking, yeah, that's what we're missing. Because if I could show through this modeling what the true impact has been. Like maybe it's not even like the new volume that's coming, but over the past 5 years, we haven't gotten capital approvals, but our volume has changed this much. And this has been the impact through the process. Like is the reason that there's not more of that modeling going on is the formulas just haven't all been created yet, dispersed yet. There's not enough technology or software out there. Like where do you see that breakdown occurring?
I think a lot of the data analytics is in some of these areas are relatively new and trying to figure out what's important. I personally always enjoyed modeling. I modeled a lot of different things over my career and using analytics. And so to me, it just sort of makes sense when I start looking at things. But I think as also some of the software systems, be it SPM or Census, you're starting to get more data, which 10 years ago, you didn't have even some of that data to help you out. So I think we're becoming more data rich. And I think that there's more things that are forthcoming to help us in those lights. You also have some folks that have actually done some studies with regard to the cost of sterilization per instrument or per tray, and doing a lot of work there, as well as Peter Nichols out of the University of Wisconsin. I know you guys have had him on the podcast and follow him well. So I think it's coming. It's just that it's been lagging.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Nichol, and obviously we're very familiar with him since he's our chief medical officer. And he's been on the podcast a number of times, actually talking about the issue of instrument optimization. And this is one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this context, because as you mentioned, like Virginia Mason, even that cost study was also tied, as you know, to optimizing trays and the impact that can have on the whole system, right? Because it could impact staffing, it impacts turnaround times, impacts costs of instrument trays, the whole shebang. Can you speak to that balance? Because I know you've had a lot of involvement around optimizing surgical instrumentation, to that interplay between trying to create accurate modeling, but not necessarily just modeling your existing inventory that may be very poorly constructed and not optimized. Because why would you want to build a model that's based on waste in your trays? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, one, you need a baseline to know where you're starting from, to know if you're going to make improvements. Two, when we started looking at used some software that was developed with a friend of mine, Larry Foster, that looked at mapping out all the instruments that are used in an operating room. And also it's helped on it was for training of the OR staff, especially with a lot of loaner instruments. And again, what he found through that, as well as in some of these other studies, you're finding that a lot of times 60-70% of the instruments that are in the hospital trays are never utilized by anybody. Basically, it may be that Dr. Doe asked for an instrument back in '02 for one specific case, and that got added to the set, and Dr. Doe's been gone for 5 years, but that instrument never got removed. And things just keep adding to that. You know, the staff, be it central sterile, be it the OR, never wants that surgeon to be felt left out. So they want to make sure that they have everything they possibly could ever need. And trying to optimize those sets, trying to take out the instruments, is a very, very heavy load, because you may have 15, 20 surgeons using that instrument set, like a basic ortho kit, and trying to get everybody to agree, when is it, get those surgeons to sit down at one time and say, okay, what is it you use and you don't use? But there is a lot of excess instruments that are in a lot of the various sets that could be removed. I know various hospital systems have been working on that, but it takes manpower and resources in a department we just said doesn't have manpower and resources. So you have to figure out a way to get those resources. And you have to, again, it's going back to the model and saying, hey, if I can reduce my instruments in X number of sets by this amount, I can reduce my hard costs to the finance folks. That means you don't have to ask for as much money for next year. That can save them some real money, but it's not like saying, hey, there's no effect on my budget. Soft dollar savings doesn't mean anything to a finance penny pincher.
That's huge. What you just said, that soft dollar savings. And what the penny pincher, so to speak, is going to say is put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to go get a resource, get an outsourced resource and tell them they get paid when they show us the results, right? And then we'll take the rest. Go ahead, come on in and do the work for free. And that can create that stalemate. But even if you get the resources, a real huge key, and you mentioned Dr. Peter Nickel, and he's talked about this and has even been this voice in his own facility, but you need a champion who has some serious gravity in the conversation and can bring some weight to it. And that doesn't mean that they're going to do the work, because they're often not. It doesn't mean that they're the only voice that you need, because they're not. You really have to look at everybody who has a skin in the game, and certainly finance does, but so does supply chain. It's a cost savings initiative for supply chain. If you can build additional inventory on those common patterns, potentially, that can be repurposed into other sets, or just by simply not continuing to purchase instruments that are just in casers that really weigh down a set. Even if you're only focused on buying new sets, just putting in a process of maintaining the concept of tray optimization when you set up a new one represents savings for supply chain as well. But to your point, there are so many instruments and there's so many reprocessings that quantifying that, which is almost intuitive, the soft savings that are available, it's almost intuitive. It's stupid not to do it. And yet, how do you translate that into the language that makes everybody go?
Right. Your point, Justin, as far as having champions is dead on. And obviously, if you can get surgeon champions, because the leadership loves to listen to doctors. And with the CMS bundled payment programs, if you have a surgeon group that is set up in one of those bundled payment programs, part of that is that if they can identify savings that they can to the surgical cases, and it may not even be their surgical cases, but if they can show that they've helped the hospital save money and reduce costs, they can get a portion of that dollar savings. So if you're in a hospital system that has the CMS bundled payment programs for total hips or total knees or some of the other ones, cardiac, and you can tie in with some of the physician, you may be able to have a surgeon, one of those folks, help lead into a small subset to say, hey, we can show this and this is how we can save some money to help in that program going forward.
So we talked a little bit about planning out 5 years ahead of time and what that means sometimes for upfront capital acquisition to sort of position yourself for that growth, and then to do the smart things financially to mitigate the true cost, bottom line cost to the organization. But here's another factor in all of this. What if you're already underwater, which is usually the case? So even in my experience, having been involved in the instrument repair industry for such a great time, whenever I went into a facility that really did not have a true preventive maintenance program, what would wind up happening is a lot of the instruments would not be safe for use. They'd be pitted, poor quality of whatever reason. And those would start getting pulled out, and there would be an upfront cost, but there would be an improvement on clinical quality, right? Mm-hmm. And you could realize that savings by reducing case delays for issues that malfunctioned with instruments and having to get the backup. And that's the culture that really prevents the optimization piece. It's trust. And what would you say to a department leader who knows that they've kind of got, like, how do you position we need to get this caught up and then we need to do a better job planning for the future? Like, that's a big leap from way behind to proactive and ahead of the schedule.
Yeah, I think you have to look at your quality metrics as far as if it's how many instruments are broken or incomplete sets, or is it that that you have missing instruments going to the operating room, or things aren't getting there on a timely basis. And like you said, you may be already over budget, but if you can turn around and do those repairs, or you need to purchase additional instruments so that you can have a higher service level and improve your quality, so you have the data to justify why you're doing what you're doing. Sometimes it's good to dive into the deep end of the pool, as long as you have the rationale and the justification to do it, because otherwise, you're just going to end up getting in worse and worse shape, and your quality and service levels are going to be going down. And it may be that someday somebody else is going to get to solve that problem.
Yeah, that's right. And even quantifying those soft costs to some degree, it is looking at case delays and tracking that, and then presenting that opportunity. Again, it may be viewed somewhat as soft because you can't predict the future, right? Predictive modeling does not always indicate that the past will repeat itself. Although that quote from, I don't know, I've heard it attributed to 1,000 different people, including Benjamin Franklin, doing the same thing and expecting a different result over and over, kind of ties into that. If we keep treating the issue the same way, then yeah, even without predictive modeling, you can pretty much bet that savings is hard.
Exactly. And again, part of it is soft costs, but it's also relationship costs. If you can't service your customer in the operating room or the clinics on a current basis, on a timely basis with quality, then even though it's a soft cost, there's also a relationship cost that you're losing as well, and a trust basis that you have to work with.
Which is the non-quantifiable inefficiency that really takes you down culturally.
Oh, it does.
And anybody who lives it in the weeds knows it's happening.
Oh, yeah.
So what are some recommendations? We kind of already teased this up, but I positioned it more in the how do you go from way behind to getting ahead. But really, I'm going to go back to the very beginning, which is you're already faced as a department leader with an unrealistic budget. You've got those clinical demands, and I think we just described that situation. The clinical demands may be even greater when the trust is not there. And then you still have this practicality around managing the budget. So maybe just, I know we're getting close to the end of the interview, so feel free to give several, but what are some recommendations that you would put out there for the audience to really help them? And I'm going to add one just before you even answer that I don't know that you'll say, but I'll add it. I think sometimes you need a third party, an outside person to come in and help tell that story because they're outside of the culture and they've had experience at multiple other facilities so they can tell the story of how you get from point A to point B. So if you don't have that personal experience, I think sometimes bringing somebody in who does is super helpful.
I think it does. I think you have a lot of times the outside consultants, even though they're going to tell the staff the same thing that you're going to tell them that you know, but hearing it from a third party, it's frustrating, but it helps because they think you're tainted. I think the other side is trying to figure out you're not going to be able to tackle everything at once. But one of the items that you can attack early and have success with, so you can show that you're making some progress. And again, we can talk about hard dollars, soft dollars, and emotion. And some of it is just, if you can start getting some of the emotional factors that, hey, we've had some success, we're getting some improvements. The other side, on a budget standpoint, to me, budgets were a guidance document. Doesn't mean that you're supposed to stick to them. The bean counters do want you to be there. But again, patient safety comes first. And so if you have to go over budget, you go over budget. The other side, from personal experience, my budgets, I end up spending more than my money in the back half of the year than the front half of the year. And bean counters were more than happy to come mid-year and take money away from me. So I learned ways to spend money, or in the med device business, I took parts out of inventory and sat on them. And so deducted out of my budget, and later in the year, I'd return them to inventory so the money would come back in my budget. So there's games like that. I think the other piece that is in my contemporaries at the med device companies wouldn't like this, but I do think that with the problems with the med device loaners, it messes up the queue times. All the plans that everybody has is a problem, and they never show up on time. And I could get into why some of that is, but I do think getting with procurement that if you have an agreement that those sets are supposed to show up 24 or 48 hours ahead of time, and they don't, there's a cost to them coming in late. And I think that you should be charging maybe it's $100 a tray because you just messed up your whole schedules, and that those get charged back, and then that comes back to your budget.
And shortcuts get taken because
Absolutely.
all of a sudden there's pressure. And especially if it's a tray that's coming in for the first time and nobody has seen the instructions for use or had the ability to prepare for the logistical reprocessing when it's coming in. I know many loaner policies are 3 days, and that will often make people crazy. But I think it's so critical to have a policy like that and have this performance risk sharing, right? Instead of just risk sharing on the bottom line, because you know this with any kind of data, whether it's financial or otherwise, you can make it tell a story. And so then you don't wind up in a partnership with the vendor or the supplier around those loaner trays. And that's really where you want to be, because that's how you gain the efficiencies that lead to success. And at the same time, there needs to be maybe this performance metric where you almost gain share when you do it right and you do it well together.
Exactly. And so I think those are some of the areas where we can go. And again, I think, tying in and understanding, having that relationship to understand where's the business going strategically. Are they planning on adding in more clinics? Are they expanding the number of ORs, or are they made a real push into a certain type of surgeries? Are they expanding the Da Vinci's and the robotics? And so that they're going to do that in 12 months. And you better be preparing the finance folks ahead of time, saying, this is going to be a huge impact, folks. We need to start preparing for this because this is coming. I know in the case of capital sales, there's times that I needed capital, and I'd start trying to make my request for capital 2 years in advance.
Because then they feel bad when they don't give it to you, and it sits on their second year in a row. They're like, well, I guess we're going to have to give it to them this time.
Exactly. And, get trading bait too. I go in with more, and hopefully they give you half of it.
What I love about this is true real world management, right? It's not, like you said, not everything is going to be something that everybody's going to be like, oh, I'm so glad that trick is out. Like even what you did with the inventory. But it's true. Everybody needs a reserve. It gets built into there. But when things get tight, they take what you haven't used, the reserve is gone, and then the emergency hits, and who gets pounded for that? Right? The clinicians and the trust and everything else. And then they just say it was poor planning on your part. And you're like, wait a second. So you don't want me to do this behavior, but the only way that I don't get my wrist slapped is if I do this behavior. So which one do you want me to do? Right? You're either going to protect my cushion or I have to do this, because either way, you're all going to hold me accountable.
That's right. I mean, one way or the other, you can get slapped.
Yeah. You know, if you want to change that, just coming from the finance perspective, you have to gain trust with the leader, because you can gain better data if nobody has to play games with the budget. If you're consistent with the budget and you do what you say you're going to do, then you have gains as well. So everybody plays it, because that's what happens in large organizations. And it's not just healthcare organizations. Like you said, it happens on the supplier side. It happens in any organization that purchases and delivers product on any level. And everybody's fighting for it, because we're all trying to run as lean as we can. And the budgets, they were already tight thanks to the Accountable Care Act. You know, it used to be the cash cow was healthcare and surgery, but budgets got tighter, you know, right around 2010. And then obviously the last 18 months really tightened it up. And I think to be successful as a manager in sterile processing, this has been a great interview for us and our audience, because I don't know that we've ever really dove this deep into the sort of financial understanding. And I know there's plenty of people out there who have that acumen, but I also know there's a lot of aspiring managers or people that are at the supervisor level, and sometimes they don't understand why they don't have what they need. And even as they prepare themselves for growing their career, a conversation like this really, I think, introduces a lot of concepts, but you introduce them in a real world. Like, you don't have to be a manager to understand how this is impacting you on a day-to-day basis. You did a phenomenal job. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, no problem. This has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it.
Is there anything you want to add before we wrap up? Did we miss something that's kind of a critical component in the discussion?
I think, you know, I'd like to add with regard to the budgeting standpoint, again, in the data, I think one of the pieces that, and Hank touched on that in his post that he and I connected on, and that was having the data. So if you can show your trends over the years, what the number of trays and instrument sets that you've been processing over the years, and also can compare that to the number of surgeries. So you can still look at the data and say, hey, you know, my budgets haven't increased, but look at the volume. This is where my efficiencies are, and this is why I need why I had the problem. So it's building that story of why you need the budget and having the data and what you've been trying to do all these years.
Boy, yeah, you took a page right out of my book. It's about how you tell the story. And when I moved from clinician to salesperson, I realized, like, you can't just slap Excel screenshots onto a page and expect people to know what that means unless they're intimately connected with that data as well. And so you got to take little pieces and you have to lay them out like a novel. There's an introduction, and then there's kind of the meat of the story and the plot development, and then there's a conclusion, you know. And honestly, if you want change to happen in your organization, you have to have access to that data, but you also need to tell the story, or almost interpret the story that the data is trying to tell everyone that's at the table.
Exactly. And not everybody understands all the bits. So you have to break it down to a very low level mentality to explain all the bits and pieces as you build that story forward.
Yeah, especially when you're working outside of the department.
Yeah.
So, David, awesome. Really great job. I enjoyed this one quite a great deal. We always tell people at the end, you know, I feel like we could have had a whole other podcast interview and rolled into an episode 2. So I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you again in the future. Maybe we can kind of take this finance conversation in another direction and tie it into another topic.
Sounds great.
That was David Kelman, founder and president of Kelman and Company Consulting, LLC. And Hank, I really loved this episode, and I think I kind of already let the cat out of the bag on why as we were wrapping up with David, but mostly because I feel like we had a pretty good sort of business conversation, but I don't feel like the way we talked about it made the content only, you know, really applicable or something that maybe somebody in a managerial position would understand. You know, it really comes down to just the day-to-day management of the inventory and how the finance side connects to that end user experience in the operating room and the cultural impact of that. And I think really tying that finance or rev cycle conversation all the way back to the frontline staff and what they're experiencing every day and how that all ties together is just one of those big picture conversations that I really enjoy having on the show. And I think the other part of it that we really discussed at the very end, and I remember when I left my role as a nurse and moved into sales, that whole conversation around telling a story. And I really was not very good at that. Not to mention, you need to know your audience. And so when you're telling that story and maybe you're trying to get a budget increase, you need to know what kind of data and how to tell the story to finance or how to tell it to supply chain so that everybody understands what you intuitively know, which is how to improve a situation that may be impacted by things like the need for tray optimization and having too many instruments that get reprocessed for no purpose, Hank.
Well, yeah. And how do you learn to tell the story? Like, as you said, Justin, you learned through years of different experiences inside and outside of the clinical setting. And for a lot of these sterile processing leaders, including myself, we get introduced to the role, hired up through the ranks from a technician level, and then we're handed these multi-million-dollar budgets and said, good luck, you're off to the races. And then we're competing with these other leaders who may not be cost centers themselves. They may be revenue centers and revenue drivers, and we're having to compete with that same amount of dollars, that limited amount of dollars there. So I really appreciate David's insight. I think it really brought up that theme that has come up again and again through the podcast and just through these industry conversations, that we need more and deeper financial training for sterile processing leaders across the board if we ever want to get to where we need to be as an industry to improve with the technology, to improve with the staffing numbers. It all comes back at the end of the day to, do you have the resources? And you can't get the resources without being able to tell the story, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could see this being almost like a mini series where we do a whole season on just, the business of the business. But I think we'll sprinkle it in instead. And I can see a future interview a few seasons down the road again, maybe with David,
maybe
like
a conference
to kind of break it down. Yeah, a conference would be a great idea.
Yeah, a whole financial sterile processing conference.
Dude, you never stop coming up with great ideas.
It's a breakthrough, and everyone got to share with the breakthrough.
And that's how it happens at Beyond Clean, everybody. Hank
Welcome
and I just start talking crap. Then Lindsay and Brad and Adam and Lisa all get involved, and it's born out of crazy conversation. So that's going to do it that's about as organic as it gets right there. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to be a guest, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself and the entire team at Beyond Clean, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.